talking in her message to the kids, talking about words you call out to God in prayer, and she had the line of asking God to give peace. One of the more common prayers that whether they have a deep faith or new to faith or no faith at all, even people that don't have faith, they still, when they get in a bind and they're in over their head, they cry out, help! That's the simplest prayer ever, is that because it's beyond, whatever's going on in your life is beyond you. So you call out for help, and where's that help going to come from? But help, Lord. So that's something to always remember. It's just the simplest prayer that we can offer is just a call for help, and God is right there by our sides. And we find that in Psalm 3 as we talk about how we fight our spiritual battles. And Psalm 3 begins, Lord, how many are my foes? How many will rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me. My glory, the one who lifts my head. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. It's kind of like a standing firm kind of prayer. I kind of cross that line. Then Paul gives a little bit of a different take in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. By the humility and gentleness of Christ. It's a little different than striking you in the jaw and breaking teeth, isn't it? But again, it's the spectrum of calling out to God. By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold toward you when away. I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take every thought captive to make it obedient to Christ. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let's pray. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. We pray that, Lord, you would give us ears to hear and eyes to see and a heart to be open to your word to us today. And that you bless us with your Spirit to give us that spiritual understanding that we just can't imagine or comprehend with our human, our natural minds. In your name we pray. Amen. So the Caldor fire ignited a month ago in Grizzly Flats. It got my attention as reports began coming in that it was heading to South Lake Tahoe. As the days went on, it became imminent that the wildfire would enter the Tahoe Basin and threatening to destroy the natural beauty and human structures in the area. And I have personal interest in the unfolding wildfire disaster. My grandma and grandpa began going there in the 1950s and stayed at Camp Richardson, which is over near Emerald Bay. Our family began going back to Camp Richardson about 10 years ago. So it hit home when I heard that it needed to be evacuated. Grandma, back in the 50s, began saving her money and bought 2 cabins. The first was near the Y, and the second closer to the airport. Both are in the vicinity of Myers, just a little bit past Myers toward South Lake Tahoe. During my childhood, my family spent 2 to 3 weeks each summer at these 2 cabins. Now, both were in the direct path of the fire, and so were under evacuation orders, and it made my heart sick to think they could be destroyed. Grandma's goal was to eventually have a house on the lake, and finally bought property in 1976 and completed the house in 1979. I called Grandma's house at Bijou or near Timber Cove my favorite place in the world. It was a half mile from Ski Run Boulevard, which took you up the hill to Heavenly Valley Ski Resort, and which was also in the evacuation zone. I couldn't imagine it burning to the ground in a wildfire. Even though none of these houses are no longer in the family, they represent my tie to Lake Tahoe that glued me to the daily reports of the Caldor fire. As I watched these reports and then heard about the evacuation of Lake Tahoe and how CAL FIRE intended to protect the towns of Myers and South Lake Tahoe, Heavenly Valley Ski Resort, and the lake itself, I felt the Lord impress upon me an analogy for how we face struggles and hardships that threaten to overwhelm us, sweep us away, or burn us out. There are many analogies in scriptures for how we face the struggles and hardships of life. And Pastor Kim will share one of them next week when she preaches on the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. So after we put on the armor of God, we are to stand firm. Standing firm was also part of Jerry St. Lucia's devotional from 1 Corinthians 15 to the deacons last Friday. So standing firm is a very important part of how we might, one of the strategies we might use in fighting a spiritual battle. But there are others. Another analogy is that we take the spiritual battle to the very gates of hell. And those gates will not be able to stand up to the advance of the church. The psalmist tells us that we find shelter in God's shadow and refuge under God's wings. God hid Moses in the cleft of the rock and was covered with God's hand as his glory passed by. Why so many different strategies to face life's hardships and struggles? Life's hardships and struggles come in many different sizes and shapes, so one strategy doesn't fit all. The common thread to each strategy is trust. But when it comes down to the details, the Lord gives wisdom for how we are to fight our spiritual battles. The strategy that the Lord gave me from how CAL FIRE brought the Caldor fire, how CAL FIRE fought the Caldor fire as it entered the Tahoe Basin, is the bend but don't break by practicing the art of deflection. And so let me show you how it works. So I'm ready, Carlos, for the slides. So this is the fire map as of August 24th. And this is day 9 of the fire. At this point, the fire had burned 122,979 acres. It started on August 15th, and where it only burned 752 acres on that first day. You can see the darkest green, that's where the fire started. And that's the 752 acres. The next green part is what happened the very next day, is when the fire exploded to over 22,000 acres. So it blew up to that many acres in just one day, and at that time it consumed the town of Grizzly Flats, which is at the is toward the top of that green shaded area. Slide 2, next slide. So this is 3 days later on August 27th, day 12, that the fire had burned over 148,500 acres. And this is when Dick Young, the executive of Zephyr Point Presbyterian Retreat and Conference Center, said, "Since last providing you an update a little less than 2 weeks ago, the Caldor fire has come to dominate much of life here at Zephyr Point, and more recently, national news headlines." Dick proceeded to quote headlines from NPR to the New York Times to the LA Times that proclaimed Caldor fire rages toward Lake Tahoe, and a hellish summer in Lake Tahoe, choked in smoke with the Caldor fire closing in fast. To which Dick Young responded, "I'm not looking to pick a fight with national news outlets, but my opinion But in my opinion, these headlines do not reflect reality on the ground. Then he said, this morning in our local paper, the Tahoe Daily Tribune, the fire officials assured residents that there is no need to worry or stress out too much. As you can see, the fire at the right side of the screen had not even got, if you know the path of Highway 50 going up to Lake Tahoe, it hasn't reached Twin Bridges or Camp Sacramento yet. So it's still a little ways, and this is the basis for this information. A little bit more assured, I have personally talked with fire officials, and not one of them believes this fire will enter the basin. I monitor the online briefings where CAL FIRE officials give twice daily updates, and what I can tell you is I am optimistic that with the massive resources currently being deployed, they will be successful in getting this fire contained. Right now, the projected for full containment is September 8th. Here is what I believe, Dick says. Zephyr Point isn't going anywhere. We're standing firm. While Zephyr Point is almost 100 years old, in the last year alone we have experienced a pandemic, earthquakes, fire, smoke, and maybe you read about the plague that showed up in some local chipmunks. And yet here we are, still standing, still planning, still preparing. When you're the executive director of a major retreat center, that's what you do. For the guests who will return and find inspiration in this very special place. And if you've been to Zephyr Point, it is awesome. But sorry, Dick, but the first strategies are not denial, sincerity, or optimism. Let's go to slide number 3. This is a couple days later, on August 29th. It's day 14. The fire increased in size to 176,000 acres. On the 28th, the fire had slowed a little bit, which might have given Dick a little bit of confidence and assurance. We only consumed 7,000 acres, but then the winds picked up, and the fire exploded again by over 21,000 acres and approached Echo Summit. So it's right there on the edge. That purple is on the edge of Echo Summit, which is the ridge above the Tahoe Basin. And this is what Dick Young, in the embers. So let's go, that's the gateway to the basin. So then let's go to the next slide. So remember, that's the 29th. This is the 30th. So you can see that the fire at the very edge, there's a couple little purple dots. That is because the embers of the fire had gone, had been caught up in the wind and plummeted 1,000 feet from Echo Summit down to the valley floor. So it had entered the valley. The growth of the fire on the 29th continued, and high winds prompted the mandatory evacuation of South Lake Tahoe on that day. You remember that day, right? Where everybody, you saw the lines of people leaving South Lake Tahoe. And not a moment too soon as the fire grew by another 13,000 acres and embers on Echo Summit fell over 1,000 feet to the valley below was spreading the fire into the lake basin. And this is what Dick Young wrote that day from Zephyr Point. How quickly things change. We all know this. It's a truism in life. But when that unbidden, unwelcome change comes, it is still a shock. Over the weekend, the Caldor fire took on new life and is fulfilling our worst fears of those of us who live in the Tahoe Basin. What seemed unthinkable just a couple days ago now seems inevitable. This morning, there were additional evacuation orders issued for all of South Lake Tahoe up to state line. While Zephyr Point is not currently under evacuation orders, it is certainly a real possibility in the days to come. Then Dick shared a word of another strategy from Psalm 116, that God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. Let's go to the next slide, Carlos, please. So this is another day, a couple days later, August 31st on day 16. So even though the fire expanded by another 12,000 acres, topping the 200,000 acre mark, the fire lines bent but didn't break as the firefighters practiced the art of deflection. They use the wind direction, natural defenses of Pioneer Trail, pathways cut for high-tension wires, and ski runs at Heavenly Valley to deflect the fire away from Myers and South Lake Tahoe. So you can see that the direction of the wind kept pushing that fire kind of northeast instead of directly up Highway 50 and toward the lake. And then, so let's go to that next slide and we'll see it a little bit more clearly. So this is on September 16th, day 31 of the fires. And you can see that one outline, kind of oval shape in the middle of your picture. That's the extent of the fire. And around that you can see lines. And those are the lines that were made of by the fire crews cutting lines and fire lines around the fire. But also there's a thicker line. That's the high tension wires that that were already there. They didn't have to do that work, but they're going to use those to continue to deflect the fire away from South Lake Tahoe and Myers. This is the amazing part. So over 218,000 acres, 71% of the fire is contained as of September 16th. 782 structures have been destroyed, which is sad. It's very sad. 81 structures have been damaged, but 16,000 structures were threatened. And so you can see the footprint from the fire, the caliber crack, the art of deflection in its bend, but don't break strategy. By allowing the wind to gradually turn the fire so that it ran a parallel course along the fire lines instead of facing a head-on assault from the flames and flying embers. The town of Myers and South Lake Tahoe and over 16,000 structures were spared. So we can also see a biblical parallel with the children of Israel, that they practiced the art of deflection while they were in Egypt in Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 through 30. And it reads, "Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, 'Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out to the door of your house until morning.' When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants." Then the people bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites did just what the Lord commanded, like first time ever, what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was a loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Just as CAL FIRE used the wind and fire lines to deflect the wildfire past Myers and South Lake Tahoe, so the Israelites used the calm of the midnight hour and blood over the door frames to deflect the destroyer away from entering any of their houses. But when the fires, floods, storms, struggles, hardships, and destroyers come our way, because Jesus says you will have trouble, how do we know which defensive strategy to use? We must trust the Lord to give us wisdom for how we fight our spiritual battles. In a passage about waging war, not as the world does, even though we live in the world, Paul starts out by appealing to the Corinthian church on the basis of the humility and gentleness of Christ. Those are not exactly fighting words, much less to plan a strategy on how to wage a war. That's Paul's point. When we find ourselves in a battle with the world, we must remember that it also has a spiritual side. Therefore, we can't fight the spiritual battle the same way we would fight a battle in the physical world. Your whole mindset must be different when you fight a spiritual battle, which is why Paul bases his appeal on the humility and gentleness of Christ. So what does it look like to fight a real-world battle with spiritual weapons? As Christians, we think of Christ accepting the will of the Father and facing Roman execution by going to the cross. It's hard to relate to a crucifixion in the 21st century. But how about this image taken on June 5th, 1989? Can you share that one, Carlos? This lone man, dressed in black pants and a white shirt and holding 2 shopping bags, stopped a column of tanks that had just participated in the Tiananmen Square massacre of Chinese students. As the tanks tried to maneuver around the man, Tank Man, as he has been named, continued to step in front of the tanks, forcing them to stop again and again. He practiced a deflecting move. Finally, the lead tank stopped its engine, and the rest of the column did the same. Like the cross of Christ, Tank Man shows us there is a spiritual side of warfare which the world cannot understand. In one sense, Tank Man stood his ground, stopping the column of tanks. In another, he practiced the art of deflection by moving in front of the tanks each time they tried to maneuver around him. Wisdom was at work aiding him in what to do next. Having a different mindset with which the humility and gentleness of Christ gives us as we engage the spiritual battle, we can reach for different weapons that will help us practice the art of deflection. The first weapon is the cross of Christ. The cross symbolizes the blood that flowed from Jesus Christ's wounded body. It is his blood that deflects sin away from us and uproots it from us. It was the blood of the Passover lamb on the doorpost that deflected the destroyer away from entering the houses of the Israelites. The blood of Christ is not a show of power, but a demonstration of humility and gentleness. That's why it's our primary weapon in spiritual warfare. Seeking wisdom for how to demonstrate the humility and gentleness of Christ is the second step in practicing the art of deflection. Third is practicing prayer. For James tells us that if anyone lacks wisdom, he should ask God, for he gives it generously to all. Prayer gives us access to the spiritual dimension. Prayer is also the language of the spiritual dimension. Not that prayer is a special language, but the common language we use evokes a deeper awareness that transcends the physical world. I have given you a handout. Hopefully you have one of the green handout that has included excerpts from the prayer of St. Patrick that I believe is a wonderful example of a prayer that helps us be more aware of the spiritual realities that are present in our physical world. The prayer is a good example of how to practice the art of deflection throughout the day. So as we close, let's read this prayer together.